A senator's family said love had limits, especially if it looked like Big Shaq's son. But when a lifeless body was found behind a locked door, those limits shattered. The same daughter they tried to protect was saved by the one they fear. And now everything they built on silence is burning under the weight of truth. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Georgia air moved differently out in the hills, thick with summer heat and quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't beg for attention, but stood like a pillar between the world and the man who lived within it. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to those who only knew the legacy, had long since stepped away from courtside fame and spotlight interviews. Now he moved through life like an oak tree in a storm, grounded, unwavering, and rarely needing to speak for people to feel the weight of his presence. Shaq had built more than basketball courts in these parts. He'd laid foundations for youth centers where kids walked in hungry and walked out with hope. He funded them quietly. No ribbon cutting, no applause, just the deep satisfaction of watching a teenager pick up a ball instead of a bottle, a book instead of a blade. He didn't need the world to know. He needed the kids to believe. His home sat on 5 acres tucked into the side of a hill that caught the last of the sun each day. It wasn't a mansion designed for opulence. It was a stronghold made for family. Inside, the walls carried laughter, the occasional scolding, and the low hum of music that told you love lived there. His mother, Lucille, was often at the heart of it all, her hands still busy in the kitchen even after raising a giant of a son and watching her grandchildren tower toward their own legacies. Sharif O'Neal, his eldest boy, moved through life with the quiet confidence of someone who knew both who he was and who he refused to become. The pressure to be like his father had never rested lightly on him, but he carried it with grace. On the court he moved like liquid steel, agile, powerful, calculated. Off the court he preferred moments that didn't ask for performance. Late-night car rides, volunteer shifts at the shelters, evening chats with Lucille, where he learned more about strength from her stories than from any training camp. Sharif was the kind of young man who nodded before he spoke, listened more than he talked, and carried respect like a stitched thread in every interaction. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to show off. His presence was proof enough that Shaq had done more than raise a son. He'd shaped a man. But in the hush of their peace, something stirred. Something approaching slow but certain, like a shadow sliding into daylight. Because no matter how carefully you build your world, you cannot always choose what steps into it. At a charity event in the city, a scholarship summit run by one of Shaq's oldest friends, Sharif had met her, Callie Hargrove, blonde, sharp-eyed, and dressed like she walked straight out of a presidential campaign photo, which, in a way, her father was Senator Warren Hargrove, a polished figurehead of Southern conservatism. He knew how to smile while making sure the rules never bent for those who weren't born into the right family, the right skin, the right lineage. Callie didn't fit that mold. Not completely. Her charm wasn't feigned. Her laughter wasn't staged. There was something searching in her gaze when she met Sharif, something restless, like a bird too smart for its cage. Their connection wasn't fast. It wasn't reckless. It built slowly, shaped by coffee conversations, after events, casual text that turned into long phone calls, and shared silences that felt like confessions. It was curiosity first, then comfort, then something unspoken but too real to ignore. Shaq noticed. He saw the way Sharif's voice carried a new softness when he spoke about her. He saw the way his son stared longer at his phone, sometimes smiling, sometimes just holding it. Shaq never asked. He'd been a young man once too. He knew the difference between a fling and a fracture-deep connection. This wasn't passing. This was the beginning of something. But beginnings are where stories get complicated. One evening, as Sharif stepped off the court after a community game, a man in a tailored suit greeted him outside the gym. The handshake was too firm, the smile too tight. He introduced himself as a family friend of the Hargroves, and spoke in a tone that didn't match his words. "I'm sure you understand the importance of discretion," the man said, voice smooth as silk and twice as cold. "The senator's daughter, she moves in a world that isn't built for certain attachment." Sharif didn't respond. He just stared, jaw locked, heart steady. He didn't need translation. He knew a warning when he heard one. He'd been raised on enough silent battles to recognize the opening shot. He told Shaq that night, not out of fear, but out of respect. Shaq had listened in silence, arms crossed, head bowed, When Sharif finished, there was no explosion, no angry rant, just a deep inhale. Then you let me worry about the men in suits. You just stay who you are. And that was the thing about Big Shaq, he didn't move fast, but when he did, the ground noticed. The next week, another youth center opened on the edge of Halston Heights, the Hargrove district. No press, no public handshakes, just Shaq, his construction crew, and a plaque that read, "For the kids who were told there's no space for them here." People noticed. So did the Hargroves. Inside the walls of his home, though, Shaq remained still. Lucille made dinner, Mara practiced her jump shot, and Sharif went back to school, back to practice, back to late-night calls with a girl whose world was beginning to unravel. Because as much as Callie wanted to pretend she could live in both realities, something always gives. And soon she'd be forced to choose. For now, in the hills of Georgia, Shaq watched the horizon, not with worry, but with the patience of a man who had seen storms come and go. The real question wasn't whether the storm was coming. It was how many would still be standing when it passed. Halston Heights looked like it had been painted from a political campaign brochure. Each house stood with the confidence of old money, trimmed hedges framing columns and copper lanterns that never burned out. It was the kind of place where time didn't pass. It performed. Every front porch held a curated version of peace, every resident fluent in subtle hierarchy. You could almost smell the generational wealth in the grass. But beneath the surface of that freshly clipped calm, the soil was sour with control, and smiles stretched tight over deeply buried fear. This was the Hargroves' domain, the kind of family that made history by pretending it never changed. Senator Warren Hargrove ran on tradition, discipline, and decorum, words that sounded noble in speeches but turned into shackles behind closed doors. His wife, Meredith, maintained the home like a museum, every surface gleaming, every object symbolic. Even the family photographs had a staged symmetry. No hair out of place, no emotion too bold. Appearances weren't just important here, they were law. And at the center of that cold perfection was their daughter, Callie. Callie Hargrove was everything they'd raised her to be. Poised, educated, fluent in the language of polite dismissal. Her features were striking, a face shaped by genetics and good lighting. But behind her eyes lived a restlessness no designer wardrobe could disguise. She had grown up inside glass walls, not to keep her in, but to keep the world exactly as her parents wanted her to see it. Filtered, arranged, approved. The university summit at Halston State was just another box on her public calendar. She'd been scheduled to speak on civic engagement, a speech someone else had written, for a cause she hadn't chosen. But that day, something unexpected cracked the mirror. It happened quietly, a glance, not staged, a presence, not anticipated. Sharif O'Neal had arrived to speak on youth leadership. Invited by the city outreach program Shaq had been funding in silence for years. Tall, calm, dressed in black. There was something about him that didn't fit the room's polished stiffness. And that's exactly what made him unforgettable. He didn't come with a media entourage or a practiced swagger. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. And that authenticity hit Callie harder than any curated charm ever had. Their first meeting wasn't cinematic. No dramatic collision. No sudden spark. Just two people who saw each other across a sea of handshakes and filtered lights and didn't look away. Callie found herself listening to Sharif's keynote with unexpected focus. He spoke with intention, but without trying to prove anything. His words weren't perfect. That made them better. He talked about discipline and chaos, about rebuilding neighborhoods with more than concrete, about how leadership wasn't always about being heard. Sometimes it was about knowing when to listen. After the event, the crowd buzzed, cameras flashed, and donors circled like bees around credibility. Callie slipped out to breathe, heels clicking on stone, phone tucked away. That's where she found Sharif, or maybe he found her, near the side entrance, taking a quiet moment beneath the shade of an old oak. They spoke like strangers who weren't meant to meet. The way two people only talk when no one else is watching. They didn't flirt. They didn't exchange numbers. But something lingered when she walked away. Something more potent than infatuation. She felt seen, not admired, not evaluated. Seen. Back home, the air in the Hargrove house was cooler. Though the thermostat never changed. Her mother mentioned the summit only to comment on her hair under the stage lights. Her father nodded at her speech, but spent more time discussing the university's next endowment play. No one asked who she met. No one cared who she connected with. And Callie, for the first time in a long while, didn't offer answers. She tucked the memory into a corner of her mind that even she rarely accessed. What Callie didn't realize was that her silence wouldn't be enough. In a town like Halston Heights, you didn't have to speak to be watched. By the following week, Senator Hargrove's office had received a discreet call, a concerned constituent inquiring about his daughter's visible interaction with a young black man at the university event. The message was coded in euphemisms, but the intent was clear. In Halston Heights, difference was danger, and association with difference, even worse. The senator called his wife into the study that night. The conversation was short, calculated. They'd seen this before. A teenage interest. Nothing that couldn't be redirected. Meredith suggested they increase Callie's media schedule. Keep her busy. Keep her away. Warren agreed, already drafting a speech that would position her as an advocate for Southern values in modern times. And just like that, they began tightening the cage. Meanwhile, Sharif returned home to Georgia. Unaware of the tides shifting beneath his feet, he hadn't expected anything, wasn't waiting for a call. But Callie reached out anyway, under a different name on a burner account, curious if what she felt had only lived in her imagination. Their messages were cautious at first, wrapped in disclaimers. Then gradually, the layers peeled. They talked about music, about places they wanted to travel, about the books they'd pretend to read just to escape a moment. There was humor, there was honesty, there was space to breathe. But even in that digital quiet, the world outside was pressing in. Halston Heights didn't yell. It whispered, and those whispers moved through the country club, through the campaign circuit, through the neighborhood HOA meetings, masked as social gatherings. The narrative had already begun. Callie's in a phase. She's exploring. She'll come around. She would not. And the more she pulled away, the more determined her family became to reel her back. Because to them, this wasn't about Sharif. It was about what he represented. Not rebellion, but truth. Not threat, but change. And in Halston Heights there was nothing more dangerous than change smiling back at you. It began with small things, barely noticeable interruptions, disguised as coincidences. Callie Hargrove's phone started dropping calls only when she tried to reach Sharif. Messages went unread, though neither of them had stopped writing. The Wi-Fi in her dorm suite mysteriously lost service during their nightly chats. Always around the same time, always just before she said something she really meant. Her internship, one she'd fought for without her father's name, suddenly restructured the roster and put her on an indefinite hold. The explanation was cordial, rehearsed, and offered with a smile that never reached the eyes. She was told by her advisor to take a break, recenter, maybe even explore therapy, as if ambition itself had become a symptom. No one yelled. No one accused. But Callie could feel it, the leash tightening around her neck, wrapped in silk. Inside the Hargrove home, words like mental fatigue and burnout floated through marble corridors and sat politely on kitchen counters beside untouched coffee. Her mother mentioned stress like it was an accessory. Her father, always perfectly timed with concern, brought up media pressure. It was all wrapped in velvet, but Callie knew a cage when she felt one. This wasn't care, it was correction. She knew because it wasn't just her they were adjusting. It was him. Rumors about Sharif started sliding between campus corners like oil on marble. Slick, quiet, hard to clean. They didn't stick because they were true. They stuck because they were familiar. He's from money, but not the kind that fits here. He's got a temper. You can tell in how quiet he is. He's a charity case with a legacy jacket. No one said the words out loud, but the subtext screamed through every whisper. The basketball coach pulled Sharif into a meeting he hadn't scheduled. Asked about his public associations. Wondered if he was emotionally stable under scrutiny. Not because of anything Sharif had done, but because someone somewhere had started a file. There was no yelling, just a nod toward expectations, and a subtle reminder that not everyone has the privilege of making mistakes. Sharif didn't tell Callie about that meeting. Not yet. He didn't want to hand her another reason to feel like their world was cracking. But he felt it. The shift. The way people stared a moment longer. How doors that once swung open now waited. He knew what it was. It was the slow poison of politeness. The kind of social warfare that never used fists, only perception. Back in Halston Heights, Senator Hargrove hosted a garden brunch for regional donors. The event glistened with safe luxury champagne mimosas. White linen, curated Shaq's name wasn't mentioned, but Sharif's picture had already made the rounds, printed out in a manila envelope, passed hand to hand beneath buffet tables. And as the senator mingled with his usual grace, a mutual acquaintance of Shaq's arrived. One of those clean-shaven middlemen, with eyes that didn't blink enough. He wasn't there to gossip. He was there to deliver a message. He didn't approach Shaq directly. That would have been too obvious. He made his way through the Southern Circuit the old-fashioned way. Through trust, backdoor respect, and calculated neutrality. The man visited one of Shaq's oldest business partners, sat through a quiet lunch at a golf club 2 counties away, and laid down the words like velvet over glass. "Nothing against the young man, of course," he said, swirling ice in his untouched drink. "It's just sensitive timing. The senator's preparing for a national run. Press will do what press does." He smiled when he said it, as if the idea of sabotage was just business. As if ruining a young man's future for political cleanliness was no more controversial than trimming an overgrown hedge. "Of course this isn't personal," the man added with a shrug. "It's just optics." But everything about it was personal. Because what they feared wasn't scandal, it was exposure. Sharif didn't fit the narrative they sold, the picture of tradition they framed. He wasn't a headline. He was a challenge. And Callie, by choosing him, even quietly, was burning a hole in the tapestry they'd stitched since the moment she was born. Shaq heard about the visit the same night. He didn't flinch. He didn't call a meeting or draft a response. He just sat with it, let it move through him like smoke. Then, like he always did, he reached for his people. Quietly, discreetly, not to fight fire with fire, but to make sure his son wasn't standing in the storm alone. Callie, meanwhile, was drowning in invitations she didn't request. Her parents wanted her at speaking events again, youth panels, heritage foundations, women's empowerment breakfasts hosted by wives of donors. She'd barely stepped off the stage from one, when her mother pressed a calendar into her hands. "I think it's time you refocus," Meredith said. Not asked, not suggested, told. Callie's protest wasn't loud. It was slow, strategic, precise. She missed one event, then another. She stopped answering curated emails, and instead began documenting everything. Screenshots, call logs, emails that hinted at mental instability when she declined an invitation. She wasn't stupid. She knew where this was headed. If they couldn't erase Sharif, they'd make her seem irrational, emotional, delicate. The old playbook of how to discredit a woman with an inconvenient heart. At school, Sharif began walking alone, more often. He still played like a machine, but his smile grew rarer, tucked behind nods and quick exits. Coaches still shook his hand, teammates still cheered, but the warmth was thinning. He wasn't sure who to trust, and that weight, heavier than any physical training, began to settle into his core. He didn't tell Shaq everything. Not yet, but Shaq saw it in his son's posture, in the way his shoulders curled inward like he was shrinking himself to survive the scrutiny. That weekend, Sharif drove to Halston Heights. He didn't text Callie, didn't announce it, just parked 2 streets away, and walked through a neighborhood that made its walls invisible, and its judgments eternal. He stood outside her gated home for exactly 6 minutes. Then he turned and walked away. He never told her he'd been there, but somehow, she knew, because that night her phone buzzed. A blocked number. One line. "They won't stop. You still in?" Callie didn't reply immediately. She sat with the question, stared out the window at the moonlight dripping over her perfect lawn, and thought about how silence had become a strategy in her life. She typed her reply without flinching. "I was in before they noticed." She hit send, then deleted the thread. Because in a world where everything was polished, their truth had to stay underground. For now, the fundraiser was never about charity. It was a photo op dressed in sequins, a carefully arranged evening for donors who already had everything. The chandeliers dripped with excess. The string quartet played as if no one had ever been poor, and the staff moved like shadows, present but unacknowledged. Callie Hargrove sat at the head table, painted into her role beside her parents like a porcelain doll. Her dress was the one her mother chose, the color a nod to the campaign's rebranding. The smile she wore was flawless, practiced and hollow. It was the kind of event where breathing felt like betrayal. The applause came on cue, and Senator Hargrove stood, giving a speech, filled with the right pauses, the right nods, the kind of language that seemed kind until you listened close. Words like heritage and values floated from his lips like sweet-smelling poison. When he mentioned preserving the integrity of our communities, Callie's stomach twisted. She'd heard that phrase before, behind closed doors, weaponized with a smirk and a glass of scotch in her father's hand. It wasn't about values. It was about control, about exclusion disguised as protection. She didn't plan it. There was no dramatic moment, no glass smashed, no shouted defiance. Just a quiet decision, a breath drawn in, and the sound of her chair scraping against the polished floor. Eyes turned. Her mother blinked twice, lips pressed into a smile that begged her to sit back down. Her father paused mid-sentence, masking the flicker of anger with a chuckle and a glance toward the crowd. But Callie didn't stop. She moved past the floral centerpieces, the carefully staged reporters, and the assistants pretending not to notice. Outside, the cold hit her like truth. She walked fast, heels clicking against the stone, pulled off her earrings in the parking lot, threw her phone into the back seat, and drove. No GPS, no music, no second thoughts. She didn't call ahead, didn't warn anyone. She just kept moving, away from the perfection, from the manipulation dressed as concern, from the walls that closed in with compliments. The road blurred past in streaks of night and headlight, and when she turned onto that gravel path leading to the O'Neill house, something inside her exhaled for the first time in years. The porch light was on, warm against the night. Lucille answered the door with the kind of calm that came from having lived through worse. She didn't ask questions, didn't judge, just stepped aside, eyes kind, hands gentle, and said, "Come on in, baby." You look tired. Callie had never been called that by someone who meant it. Inside, the house was quiet. The smell of something baked lingered in the air. She didn't speak for a while, just sat on the edge of the living room couch, fingers laced, eyes unfocused. Lucille brought her a blanket. Sharif appeared from down the hallway, shirt loose, concern written across his face, but not pushing it onto hers. He sat across from her, silent, waiting. Eventually, Callie looked up. "They tried to drown me in compliments," she said, voice low. Sharif nodded. He knew the language of subtle control better than anyone. They didn't speak of politics, or threats, or consequences. Just sat there, the silence thick but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence people share when they've stopped performing. Later they moved to the porch. The night was cool, the air humming with crickets, and the faint rustle of trees. Callie wrapped herself in the blanket, legs tucked under her. Sharif sat beside her, not close enough to overwhelm, just near enough to say he was there. Somewhere between one breath and the next, Callie leaned her head on his shoulder. They sat like that. Two people who had crossed a line no one could see but everyone would feel. The camera flash was almost imperceptible. From the dark line of trees beyond the property, a lens caught the moment. The senator's daughter, face tilted toward the man the world wasn't ready to see her beside. By morning it was everywhere. Not the picture, just the suggestion of it. Basketball star's son seen with senator's daughter in late-night visit. No mention of where, no detail about why, no confirmation of anything intimate. But the message was clear. Headlines didn't need facts. They just needed friction. The photo itself never surfaced. But it didn't matter. The implication had been planted, and in the hands of the press, it was enough to bloom into scandal. Talk shows spun theories. Online forums dissected. Sharif's background, old interviews of Shaq resurfaced, twisted into commentary on race. Parenting inappropriateness. Campus gossip turned venomous. Some students defended them. Others whispered about ambition, about using connections, about how fast girls fall for status. None of it was rooted in truth. But that was never the point. At the Hargrove home, silence reigned. Senator Hargrove canceled his next appearance. Meredith stopped returning press calls. Callie was removed from the next month's public calendar, her health cited as the reason. Behind closed doors, arguments erupted, cold, calculated ones. There were no raised voices, just ultimatums wrapped in logic. "You forced our hand," her father said. "We have a duty to protect your future. And this isn't a future, it's a phase." Callie didn't scream. She didn't explain. She packed a bag. Meanwhile, at the O'Neill home, Shaq sat at the dining room table, with the paper spread out before him. He didn't curse, didn't react. He just scanned the headline, jaw clenched, and passed it to Lucille, who read it with narrowed eyes, and shook her head. "She's going to have to choose," she said softly. "She already did," Shaq replied. In the backyard, Sharif ran drills with his sister. His movements were sharp, focused, relentless, but his face, that told the real story, a quiet storm gathering behind his calm. He knew what was coming. Not just for him, for her. And still, when he saw Callie walk up the driveway again that evening, duffel in hand, shoulders straight, he didn't flinch. He stepped forward, took the bag from her, and held the door open. Inside that house, she wasn't a scandal. She was just Callie. And for the first time in her life, she was home. The headlines didn't slow. They multiplied like wildfire in dry brush, each take more dramatic than the last. Cable news anchors fed their panels sound bites, as if they were gospel, fueling debates with clipped footage and speculative rhetoric. Is this a political scandal, or a misguided romance? Should the children of public figures be held accountable for optics? But the real question they danced around, the one no one dared say outright, was rooted in the same sickness that birthed the whispers to begin with. How dare she fall for him? Talk shows had a field day. One host held up a blurred still of Sharif walking beside Callie on the O'Neill's property and dissected it like a criminal trial. Another called it poor judgment on the part of both families, as if love or even the possibility of it could be measured in spreadsheets and legacy columns. The more cautious outlet spoke in code, troubling entanglement, unmonitored proximity, contrasting values. No one needed to say what they meant. The message was understood loud and clear. Behind the cameras, things got uglier. Politicians who had once fundraised beside the Hargroves began backing away, citing concerns over optics. Corporate donors quietly redirected support to safer candidates, sending sterile emails full of appreciation and strategic detachment. Senator Hargrove's re-election team began to fracture, some staffers jumping ship to avoid the growing cloud. The Hargroves responded with carefully crafted statements, emotionally neutral but morally loaded. Meredith released a single-page letter to her private mailing list, expressing concern for her daughter's emotional state, and assuring everyone that Callie's well-being is our utmost priority. No mention of Sharif. No mention of truth. But the most brutal blow came when a formal accusation was filed anonymously to the university board, alleging that Sharif had exerted undue influence over Callie's choices. There was no substance, no evidence, just a signatureless document sent through the back door. Sharif was never called guilty, but the stain was there. Suspicion lingers long after truth is cleared. Shaq, upon hearing of the letter, didn't lash out. He didn't call a press conference or threaten lawsuits. He simply folded the report, tucked it inside a drawer in his study, and poured himself a glass of water. He sat down at the edge of his back porch, watching the trees sway in the wind like nothing had changed. But his silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Shaq didn't fight wars on impulse. He waited until the ground told him it was time. Sharif handled it differently. The threats began showing up in his inbox. Anonymous messages telling him to step back, to know his place, to stay in his lane. His social media filled with comments that sounded reasonable at first glance, but were lined with barbs. Some called him ambitious, some called him dangerous. None of it was really about him. It was about what he represented in their story. An interruption, a disruption, a fracture in the comfort of the expected. The only place he felt peace was in that home. The O'Neill house became a shell against the noise, with Lucille cooking more than usual, and Munira hovering close like a storm-conscious bird. Shaq didn't offer lectures, didn't give speeches, just looked his son in the eye one evening and said, "Don't let them steal your center." And then Callie vanished. No goodbye text, no voicemail, no online footprint. Her university friends hadn't seen her. Professors said she missed class. Her campus email bounced back with an automatic reply, on extended leave. At first, Sharif didn't panic. He thought maybe she'd needed space. Maybe her parents had pulled her somewhere remote, somewhere they could isolate her long enough to break her down. But when a full day passed, then two, and her burner account stayed silent, that's when the chill set in. A deep, slow fear that curled around his spine like ice. He didn't go public. Didn't tell the press. He drove to Halston Heights and parked 3 blocks from her house. Watched the gates. No movement. No sign of life beyond the flicker of motion-sensing lights, and the hum of political machinery still operating in the background. Shaq, watching his son spiral inward, made a single phone call. It wasn't to the police. It wasn't to a journalist. It was to a former friend, a man whose influence didn't come from titles, but from what he knew and how deep he could reach. The call was short, direct. "I need to find a girl." Quietly. The man didn't ask questions, just said, "I'll call you back." Hours passed. Then came a name, a location, an old estate, owned by Meredith's sister buried in the foothills 2 counties over. No social media, no staff, Just a caretaker and a privacy clause that would make a senator's heart sing. Shaq didn't tell Sharif. Not yet. Because in that moment, what his son needed wasn't coordinates. It was to remember that they were still playing the long game. That dignity wasn't silence. It was restraint under fire. And that reputation, the very thing used as a weapon against them, could be repurposed. Because reputation may be a loaded gun, but in the right hands, it becomes protection. A signal, a reminder that no matter how many headlines scream your name, the truth doesn't change. It waits. The ring shattered the night, like a scream through silence. It wasn't the kind of call you sleep through. It was sharp, urgent, unnatural. Sharif's hand reached the phone before his mind caught up. The screen glowed. Unknown number. 3. Something in his chest clenched. A tight coil of dread, winding fast. He answered with a hoarse hello, but the voice on the other end didn't wait. She's down. A bar off Forsyth. Bathroom. She's not responding. Ambulance is coming. You need to get here. Now. The line clicked dead, before he could ask who it was. But he didn't need to. The air had already shifted. Something inside him broke loose, like a dam giving way. He was on his feet, before the phone hit the dresser. Shaq heard the footsteps. He was downstairs in seconds, dressed, keys in hand. Sharif didn't have to explain. One look at his face and Shaq knew. They were in the car before the house had fully realized the night was breaking. No words, no radio. Just the road unfurling, like a dark ribbon, and the weight of urgency sitting heavy between them. Shaq gripped the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him steady. Sharif sat motionless, his knee bouncing, eyes locked on the windshield, as if willing the world to move faster. Neither of them asked how. They only drove. The city didn't sleep, but it did hide. Especially at night. Especially in corners most people pretended didn't exist. The bar was nondescript, buried between a boarded-up pawnshop and a neon-lit check-cashing storefront. The parking lot was half empty, emergency lights washing the asphalt in red and white. 2 paramedics stood by the entrance. One was talking into a radio. The other looked at Sharif, and paused, recognition flashing in his eyes, quickly followed by something softer. She's inside, he said, voice low. Stable. For now. The door swung open to the kind of silence that hums louder than noise. Sharif pushed past it, his heart pounding so hard it muffled everything else. The bar reeked of stale beer and disinfectant. A back hallway led to the bathrooms, blocked off by a yellow rope no one respected. The door to the women's room was open. Inside, Callie lay on the tile floor, a paramedic kneeling beside her, checking vitals. Her skin was pale, her hair damp against her face. Her eyes were half-lidded, her breathing shallow, uneven. She looked like a ghost. Sharif dropped to his knees next to her, the cold tile biting through his jeans. He reached for her hand. It was limp but warm. She's not overdosed, the paramedic said, scanning a chart. No narcotics in her system. It's strange. She's disoriented, dehydrated, but not high. Sharif didn't speak. Couldn't. He just held her hand, brushing his thumb over her knuckles, whispering her name like a prayer. Shaq stood in the doorway, watching. His eyes moved slowly around the room. The overturned purse, the lipstick smeared across the sink, the bleachy tang in the air. Too clean, too staged. He knew mess when he saw it. This wasn't an accident. It was a message. An officer approached, tablet in hand. We pulled footage. You're going to want to see this. Shaq followed him out, down a side corridor to a staff office. A monitor glowed in the dim room. The video was black and white, grainy but clear. The camera pointed at the bar. Timestamp 102. Callie sat alone, nursing a drink. She looked tired, detached, her phone face down on the counter. A man approached, tall, clean-shaven, suit tailored to political perfection. He smiled, leaned in close. She looked surprised, not scared, but unsure. He said something, laughed. She shook her head, then he reached over and touched her glass. Just a quick flick of the fingers, a drop, unnoticeable. Shaq leaned closer, the flicker of recognition dawning. He knew that face. It was Russell Maddox, Callie's godfather, longtime campaign strategist, political cleaner, the man who never stood in front of the camera, but always stood behind the puppet strings. Shaq's jaw tightened. The officer paused the video, unsure of what to say. Shaq said nothing. He didn't need to. By the time they returned to the hospital, Callie had been stabilized and moved to observation. Sharif hadn't left her side. He sat in the chair next to her bed, hoodie up, head low. His eyes were bloodshot, but dry. Grief hadn't set in because something more potent had taken its place. Rage, tightly bottled beneath a calm he learned from his father. She opened her eyes for a second. He said when Shaq walked in. She said, "I didn't drink it." "That's all." Shaq nodded, stepping closer, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. It was firm, grounding.
"We know," he said.
There was no plan that night. No strategy. Just breath. Just waiting. The news hadn't broken yet. But when it did, it would unravel everything. This wasn't about romance anymore. It was about survival. About truth. About how far a man like Maddox would go to protect the system he helped build. And how far a father and son would go to tear it down. Because now it was real. It wasn't a smear. It wasn't speculation. It was a woman drugged in the dark by a man who smiled in press photos beside her family. And even though she lived, something fundamental had died. The illusion. The performance.
The leash.
Gone. And in its place, something far more dangerous had awakened. Conviction. Callie survived, but survival came at a price. When she opened her eyes in the hospital room, the world outside was already spinning narratives faster than she could catch them. Her father arrived first. Alone. No mother, no entourage. Just the tight-lipped senator version of himself wrapped in a clean suit. And disappointment. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't touch her hand. He simply stood at the foot of her bed, took one long look, and said, "You need to come home." But Callie didn't answer. Her body was weak, but her silence was stronger than it had ever been. He took it as defiance. It was actually the sound of something inside her finally breaking free. While the doctors ran tests and nurses whispered in corners, the Hargrove camp began its spin. The press releases were crafted with surgical precision. A vulnerable young woman, overwhelmed by external pressures, concerns about the environment she'd been exposed to, carefully coded statements that painted her not as an adult, not even as a victim, but as a girl misled, dragged into a world too complicated for her. And Sharif, he became the scapegoat. Again, the media flooded with thinly veiled accusations. Pundits debated whether his background made him unstable. Anonymous sources hinted that he'd been overly persuasive. One article cited a pattern of boundary issues. A phrase with no source, no examples, just damage. Talk shows brought in specialists who didn't know either of them, but spoke with authority about trauma bonding and the risk of manipulation in relationships that cross cultural boundaries. They never said race. They didn't have to. Shaq saw the headlines and the clips and the blur of misinformation dressed as concern. He didn't yell. He didn't storm into press conferences. He made one call to a friend. An old contact from his days in the business of visibility, then uploaded the footage to a secure drive and sent it to one inbox, the inbox of an independent journalist known for blowing holes in political myths. There was no signature, no watermark, just the truth, time-stamped and sharp. The footage went live within 24 hours. No spin, no commentary, just raw security camera footage, showing Russell Maddox, Callie's godfather and longtime Hargrove campaign strategist, slipping something into her drink with the ease of a man who'd done it before. The tape showed him smiling, leaning close, patting her on the back like an uncle at a reunion. The silence that followed the video's release was deafening. Before it detonated, investigations opened within the hour. Maddox vanished. No public statements, no appearances, no denials. His condo in D.C. was cleared out, his social media wiped clean. The senator's press team canceled every public engagement for the next month. Damage control became a full-blown containment crisis. But it was too late. The campaign didn't just take a hit, it collapsed. Donors fled, endorsements were withdrawn. The National Party issued a statement of deep concern that read more like a threat. Within a week, Senator Hargrove was no longer a frontrunner for anything. Yet for all the public fallout, the private damage ran deeper. Callie returned to campus under a shadow she didn't ask for. Students stared. Professors paused. Classmates whispered. She had become a symbol, not a person. Both admired and resented, depending on what part of the story people believed. To some, she was the girl who'd exposed a political predator. To others, she was the girl who brought drama and made things messy. She walked through the cafeteria with headphones on, not for music, but to shut out the weight of judgment that followed her like perfume. Her inbox filled with hate, praise, and confusion. none of which she asked for. Sharif walked beside her when she needed, behind her when she did. He understood. This wasn't about him anymore. Not really. But when the university tried to issue a formal statement in her name, without her permission, Callie broke her silence. She walked into the dean's office. No lawyers, no press, and handed over a statement of her own. 1 page. No embellishment. Just a clear timeline of what happened and who was responsible. At the bottom, she wrote, "Stop telling my story for me." The dean didn't reply. He didn't need to. The paper was published that afternoon unedited. Outside the university walls, the narrative shifted. Not quickly, not cleanly, but it shifted. People began to ask different questions about how reputations are protected, about who gets believed, and about what it costs a young woman to love someone the world tells her she shouldn't. Meanwhile, Shaq stayed in the background. He took no interviews, issued no tweets. He coached kids, cleaned up after practice, and kept his phone off most days. But behind closed doors, he was building something. A legal case, yes, but also something deeper. Infrastructure, protection, legacy. He had learned that influence meant nothing if you didn't use it to shelter people. When the storm came, Sharif watched Callie rebuild in fragments. One morning, she returned to the O'Neill house for breakfast. Lucille hugged her longer than necessary. Malara poured her orange juice like nothing had happened. They didn't say much, just passed plates and stories like normal, like family. After the meal, Sharif walked her to her car. "You okay?" he asked. Callie leaned against the driver's door, looked at him, eyes tired but steady. "I'm not broken," she said. "Just uninvited." He nodded. No promises, no vows, just presence. That night she posted one picture to her private account, a blurry shot of the porch light at the O'Neill house. No caption, no tag, just the light. It went viral anyway, because the world still wanted a story. But this time she was writing it herself. There were no flashing lights in the studio lobby, no red carpet, no wall of paparazzi clawing for a quote. Just silence, a heavy, charged stillness that wrapped around Callie Hargrove like armor. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. She sat on the edge of a green room couch, staring into the muted screen on the wall, where a countdown ticked beneath the logo of the primetime show that had invited her, not because they believed her story, but because the world had made it too loud to ignore. She didn't want the segment. She didn't trust the network. But the moment demanded something more than controlled releases and polished statements. The whispers were turning into narratives again. Her silence, once her sanctuary, was now being painted as guilt, or worse, complicity. So she chose the only tool left, her voice. The producer approached quietly. She was young, nervous, probably just following a line of notes fed to her by higher-ups. "You'll have 10 minutes, we'll run your video montage at the halfway mark. Footage from the youth summit, the college gala, the court documents, then it's just you and the host. No interruptions. You ready?" Callie didn't nod. She didn't need to. She stood and walked with the calm of someone who knew that breaking was no longer a threat. It had already happened, and now she was something else entirely. The lights were bright but not blinding. The host welcomed her with a practiced smile. A gentle thank you for being brave, the kind of line meant to comfort the audience more than the guest. Callie waited, still as stone, until the formalities dropped. The screen behind them flickered to life. Her face filled the frame, the bar footage, headlines. A muted image of Sharif on campus, and then cut to her live. "Callie," the host began, voice measured. "You've been through a harrowing ordeal, and many are asking, why speak now?" Her lips parted, not to deliver a monologue, not to plead, just to tell the truth, plainly. "I didn't overdose," she said. "I was erased." The room shifted. No one breathed. "I was erased by people who claimed to love me, who smiled in every family portrait, who built a campaign on integrity, while silencing my voice behind closed doors. I was erased by a system that thought I'd sit down, stay quiet, and apologize for surviving something they orchestrated." The host leaned forward, but didn't speak. She was no longer guiding the conversation. Callie had taken it. "They called it a scandal," she continued. "They said I was manipulated, that I lost myself in someone else's world. But the truth is, I found myself in it. I wasn't lost. I was seen, for the first time. And that scared them more than anything else. The feed jumped to the bar footage. Russell Maddox. The drop into her glass. The disarming smile. They said he was family, she said, not looking at the screen. But real family doesn't drug you. Real family doesn't erase you to protect a narrative. There was no dramatic swell of music. No commercial break. Just Callie, raw and centered, cutting through decades of polite oppression with steady eyes and unapologetic clarity. Sharif didn't save me, she said, because I didn't need saving. I needed space. He gave me that. When the world turned me into a headline, he didn't speak for me. He stepped back. That's what love looks like. Not control, not protection at the cost of identity, just room to speak. The audience in the studio was still. Every camera trained on her. The host blinked once, as if recovering from being hit by something unseen. What do you want now, Callie? She asked finally. Callie turned to face the camera, her voice quieter but no less powerful. I want every girl who's been told she's imagining things to know she's not. I want every boy who's been labeled a threat for simply existing to know he's more than what they say. And I want the people who use silence as a weapon to know mine's done protecting them. The show ended without applause. Outside, in the crisp city air, Sharif stood near the side entrance, his back to the car, hoodie pulled up. He hadn't watched from the studio audience. He didn't need to. His role in this part of the story was not to stand beside her, but to wait where she could find him. When the door opened, she walked toward him slowly. No fanfare, no spotlight, just two people meeting again, after everything had changed. He looked at her, eyes steady. How'd it feel, he asked. She didn't smile, just stepped closer, shoulders square. Like I finally stopped whispering. He opened the car door. She stepped in. As they drove through the city, lights blurring through the windshield, neither of them spoke for a while. They didn't need to. Callie had broken the rules, not by screaming, but by daring to speak where she wasn't meant to. And the world, whether it liked it or not, had heard her. The fall of the Hargrove name didn't come with sirens or scandalous outbursts. It came with the quiet click of doors closing that once stood open. Donors stopped calling. Endorsements dried up. The family name, once revered in political corridors, started echoing in hallways with the uncomfortable ring of liability. Articles spoke of a difficult chapter, and the party line shifted to future prospects. Younger faces, cleaner reputations. Warren Hargrove didn't resign publicly. He just disappeared from relevance, swallowed whole by the very system he'd once commanded. Callie didn't mourn it. There was no grieving for the image she'd once been forced to uphold. No nostalgia for the cold perfection of marble countertops and curated press dinners. When she left her father's home for good, she didn't pack heirlooms or family photos. She took her journals, 2 suitcases of clothes, and a copy of The Fire Next Time she'd once hidden behind a row of etiquette manuals on the living room shelf. That was all. She found a small apartment on the edge of the city. Not flashy, not expensive, but hers. The walls were plain, the furniture secondhand. The first night she sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, listening to the wind whistle through the old window pane. It was the first time in years that the silence didn't feel like a cage. It felt like space. But healing, like grief, doesn't move in straight lines. There were days when she couldn't get out of bed, mornings when she flinched at every notification, expecting headlines to claw her back into the spotlight. And there were nights when the isolation weighed heavy. Despite the freedom, she was alone. Yes, but it wasn't loneliness. It was transition, the kind that came after a storm, and before the planting of anything new. The O'Neills didn't show up with fanfare. They drifted into her life like roots breaking through concrete steadily, without force. Lucille called first, asked how she was sleeping, then asked what she was eating. The next week she invited her over for Sunday dinner, not as a guest but with an apron already waiting. In the O'Neill kitchen, everything was alive. Lucille's voice bounced off the tiled walls, telling stories that didn't need punchlines. She didn't hover, didn't coddle. She handed Callie a cutting board, a handful of sweet potatoes, and said, "If you can peel, you can stay." It was the kind of initiation that made Callie feel like she belonged without needing to ask. Over time, Callie learned the rhythm of the kitchen, the spice placements, the pace of prep, the gentle insults Lucille threw when something was under-seasoned. She didn't just cook, she rebuilt trust with her hands. Mayra brought her into the fold in her own way. One evening, she She knocked on Callie's door with a basketball tucked under her arm and said, "You're coming with me." No further explanation. They drove to a quiet neighborhood court lit by nothing but a crooked street lamp and the moon. There, a rotating group of cousins, neighbors, and local kids ran informal games that went late into the night. Callie didn't play, but she cheered, fetched water, and laughed until her cheeks hurt. It wasn't about basketball, it was about community. Unstaged, unfiltered, real. And then there was Sharif. He never asked what came next. Never hinted at plans or expectations. He came by when she needed him, stayed back when she didn't. One evening, she invited him over without thinking. He brought a plant, not flowers, a plant, a living thing she'd have to care for. He placed it on the windowsill without a word. Later, as they sat on the floor, backs against the couch, Callie asked the question that had been circling her mind for weeks. "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened? All of it?" Sharif didn't answer right away. He reached for his drink, looked out at the night. "I wish you hadn't been hurt," he said finally. "But I don't regret finding you in it." She looked at him then not as a chapter she'd survived, but as a choice she was still making. "I'm not ready to be someone's girlfriend," she admitted. He smiled, slow and soft. "Good," he said. "I'm not looking for one." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was acknowledgement, understanding. What he wanted was someone whole. Someone rebuilding, not for him, but beside him. In the months that followed, Callie reclaimed herself in pieces. She painted one wall in her apartment, the exact shade of midnight blue she once saw in Lucille's kitchen tiles. She joined a writing group, started mentoring freshman girls. She wrote essays, most unpublished, some read in small local events. One was titled, "The Cost of Inheritance." Another was simply called Porchlight. Her relationship with her past didn't vanish, but it softened, became something she could look at without bleeding. And slowly, without labels or announcements, the O'Neills became her people. Not because of blood, but because they made space. Because they didn't ask her to shrink. Because they offered her not just love, but truth. And in that truth, Callie built her home. The gym was alive before the ribbon was ever cut. Sneakers squeaked across the freshly waxed court. Echoes of laughter danced through the rafters. And sunlight poured in from high glass panels that hadn't seen their first layer of dust yet. It wasn't just a building, it was a pulse, a promise. Brick and mortar wrapped around intention. The grand opening of the O'Neill Youth Center wasn't the kind of event flooded with celebrities or televised speeches. There were no camera crews, no brands, no gloss, just community, and that made it holy. Shaq stood in the center of it all, not towering as he had once on NBA hardwood, but grounded in something deeper. His presence didn't shout, it held. The kids circled around him weren't fans. They were sons and daughters of neighborhoods that had been forgotten, gentrified, redlined or ignored. Kids who were too used to hearing no, too familiar with locked doors and curfews spoken like threats, instead of guidance. Here the light stayed on after sunset. Here they were wanted. He didn't talk about his championship rings. Not once did he mention the Lakers, the Heat, or MVP titles. He didn't need to. Those accolades had built the platform, but this was what he built with it. He stepped forward slowly, eyes sweeping across the crowd. Kids, teens, parents, teachers, people who had watched him from a distance now standing close enough to see his scars. "You all know me as Big Shaq," he began, voice low but thick with gravity. "Some of you know me as Mara's dad, Sharif's dad. Maybe you've seen me on TV, talking about basketball, or cracking jokes. But let me tell you what matters more than all that. Pain." The words settled in the room like a truth people had always known, but rarely heard spoken with that kind of simplicity. "I've been praised in stadiums, and ignored in boardrooms," he continued. "I've seen both sides of the American dream, and I've learned the real legacy we leave isn't measured in points or trophies. It's measured in how many people we make room for, how many we lift when the world tries to keep them down." He looked toward the sidelines, where Sharif stood beside a group of younger kids, demonstrating footwork drills. He was calm, patient, giving out corrections like affirmations. He moved with purpose, not performance. And just beyond him, Callie sat with a few teenage girls at a long table by the entrance, each of them bent over journals, heads nodding to her gentle voice guiding them through the day's reflection prompt. Shaq's gaze lingered on them both. "They tried to define my son with a rumor," he said. tried to erase a girl because she chose to stand in the light instead of behind it. But here's the truth. They didn't break. They rebuilt. There was no applause. Not yet. Just silence. The kind that doesn't ask for reaction, but demands respect. This place, he gestured around them, arms wide, isn't for stars. It's for fighters. It's for the ones who don't fit into neat little boxes. It's for the girls who speak when told to sit. For the boys they label aggressive, before they ever hear them speak. This center is a reminder that survival isn't enough. We deserve to thrive. He stepped back. Applause followed, but not the kind made for soundbites. This was the kind of applause that rose from deep in the chest, from truth felt in the gut. The kind that said, "We see you, we believe you, we're with you." After the formalities ended, the day melted into real life. Basketballs bounced. Music played through portable speakers. Barbers set up chairs along the back wall, offering free haircuts. A table of volunteers distributed notebooks, pencils, and meals, without asking for names. There was no VIP section, just people, shoulder to shoulder. Sharif ran drill after drill, with groups rotating through every hour. His voice remained steady, never rising, always pulling the best out of each kid without having to bark. He didn't coach for dominance. He coached for dignity. Between sessions, he stepped outside for air. Callie joined him, a bottle of water in one hand, the faintest sheen of sweat on her brow. Her eyes met his. "They love you," she said. "I love them," he replied. They stood in that moment, wrapped in the sound of community unfolding inside. Two people who had been turned into metaphors and now were simply living. "You ever think about what would have happened if we'd listened?" she asked. He didn't ask who she meant. "Sometimes. But then I remember, we didn't survive all that to imagine a version of us that doesn't exist. We chose, and the cost. Worth it." Inside, Lucille supervised the food table, giving out seconds and advice in equal measure. Mira organized a free throw competition. One boy refused to shoot until she shot first. She did, nothing but net. He grinned wide and took his shot. Airball. But the smile stayed. Because here, failure wasn't failure. It was learning. As dusk settled, families filtered out. The building emptied. Only staff and a few volunteers remained. The gym lights dimmed just enough to let the early stars peek through the skylights. Shaq walked toward the far wall, where a bronze plaque had been mounted beneath a mural painted by a local artist. The mural depicted an open door spilling light into a dark hallway. No faces, just space. Invitation. He paused in front of the plaque, then called for Sharif and Callie to join him. They stood side by side, just as they had in Shadows and Storms. Shaq nodded once, stepped back, and let them read it for themselves. This place exists because someone refused to stay silent. Beneath it, in smaller letters, dedicated to Sharif O'Neal and Callie Hargrove, for choosing each other in a world that told them not to. Callie reached out and brushed her fingers across the lettering. Not for the cameras, not for the crowd, just for herself. "I never imagined this," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Neither did they," Sharif said, "which is why we had to." The lights flickered above them. Not out, just shifting. Evening had come, but the work was only just beginning. Outside the center, the street lamps clicked on one by one. Inside, the air was warm with something unshakable. Not hope, not victory, but purpose. And purpose is louder than legacy. If this story stirred something in you, don't just scroll past it, stand in it. Keep showing up for voices that don't fit inside the frame. Because love isn't the threat, silence is. And every time you choose truth over comfort, you're writing the next chapter with us.